Hi, welcome to episode 5 of Cryonaut TV. I'm Jake, and today we're going to continue talking about frequency modulation synthesis, or FM synthesis, specifically ratios, and how they can impact your sound in really cool ways. So in our last video, I kind of gave you guys a basic overview of FM synthesis. We showed you FM8 and a little bit of operator, and just kind of how the whole thing kind of works, how you have these different operators here, the modulators and carriers, and how they interact, how you can, in FM8 at least, how you can use the filter, and just all how this kind of this one works, and also how the basics of synthesis works for frequency modulation. So today I wanted to dig in a little deeper into the ratio section. So FM8 has ratio here, and then offset, and then operator has this coarse and fine section, as well as a little fixed button. They pretty much do the same thing, but they do act a little bit differently. And if you have a different synth, it may look even different still, but I'm going to give you guys a little bit of explanation how these kind of things work. And so hopefully you can take that and apply it to your synth, whichever one you may be using, and it'll give you a better understanding of the general sense of how ratios work with FM. So I'm going to be sticking with sine waves just because it's simple. No need to worry about how this will change your sound. We'll go into that later maybe. Right now it's only about the ratio. So some of these sounds may sound better with different waveforms, but that's not the point of this video. So we're going to be using F as our carrier signal, and then we're going to have only E as our modulator, just to keep it simple again. And let's bring it up to 37. So a pretty mild amount of modulation there. We don't want to have too much most of the time because it turns into noise, and it's enough that you'll be able to hear it. So as I bring it in, you can hear the modulation start to happen. Oh, that's the wrong synth. So there you can see there's a little bit of an effect, but nothing too crazy. So it's a mild effect. That's usually what I go for with FM. And again, if you add more of these, it'll stack and just get really crazy eventually. So for each one you add, you want to be pretty mild at first, and then kind of build your sound slowly. See how it affects your sound. So with FM8, the ratio, it starts with 1 across all of these. Now, if you were to bring this up to 2, it moves fast, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're not going up to 2 octaves, 3 octaves, 4 octaves, 5 octaves. It kind of works sort of in an exponential way. I'm not that good at math, maybe that's the wrong term, but it goes from 1 to 2 is an octave, and then it goes 2 to 4, and then 4 to 8, 8 to 16, etc. So it doubles, and that's your octave span. And then the same thing on the way down. It goes from 1 to 0.5, 0.5 to 0.25, 0.25 to 0.125, etc. Again, dividing by 2 in that sense. So keep that in mind. This is a thing a lot of people mess up at first. It makes sense, you would think, to go up to 2 octaves or 3 octaves, but that's not how this works. So as we play a note now, we're at 2. You can hear it just shoot up in the octaves there. So let's put it back to 1. And then we go 2. You can hear it's a bit higher pitched now, and that's not because the E signal is going to the output. It's just moving an octave higher, so the waveform is a lot shorter together, closer together, so it's impacting F in a very different way, making the overall sound a higher pitch. And then if we go up to 3, you can really hear it in the harmonics there. So as we turn this off and on, you can still hear a bit of the original signal. It's just added with those overtones now from the modulator. can hear it a lot. And because 5 is not an actual octave, that would have been 4, now you can start to hear some other harmonics that are coming in and really making an interesting sound. And again, FM synthesis is really known for those metallic sounds, and that starts to show quite a bit right here. It's starting to sound kind of metallic. You can make a bell sound out of this really quickly and easily. So let's go. Oh, come on. Again, now we're at like halfway to the next octave, so again, interesting. And that's another octave there, but it's so high it's starting to get, I think, kind of absurd sounding. I don't usually go this high with most of my sounds. And so when you only have these two acting together, it's very obvious that you have a really high octave ratio sound kind of thing going on here. So generally you don't want to have only one modulator very high up. You want to have maybe one closer to the original sound, closer to 1 or 2 or something, and then a higher one. So it provides more of a span of sounds, not just jumping from 1 to 8. But that's all I'm going to show you for moving up incrementally like that. You can see it moves up and changes the sound quite dramatically. So now if we go back to 1, there's the original sound with both the same octave. And so if we were going to go start moving down now, we would go to 0.5. And that's the same note I was just playing. Again now, but because this sine wave is playing at a lower frequency, it takes longer for each waveform to actually play. And so it really lowers the overall sound. And then for the next one, it's going to be 0.25. So this can have interesting sounds when you play higher in the keyboard, because you have all those lower sounds coming in with it. That's the original. So it changes it again quite a bit. So now if we go down one more, if you play a lower note, it's almost inaudible. It just sounds pretty bad. But when you play the higher notes, you get a really weird kind of, I don't even know how to describe that. But it's combining a high pitch with a really low pitch that's, again, like you can almost hear the waveform modulating, and it creates a pretty cool sound. So then if you combine that with something else, let's add in here maybe a 2. I mean, that's a weird sound, at least. So, and then you can go on to process it. You can change the waveforms themselves, which will give you infinite possibilities there. So yeah, just playing with the ratio can change your sound to really interesting things quite dramatically. So if you're just starting out with FM synthesis, I would recommend mostly sticking with just your octaves, like I was saying, the 1, 2, 4, 8, whatever, and 0.5, 0.25, 0.125. That will get you sounds that are in the same, the same scale at least, the same pitch for the most part, or tuning, I mean. If you were to just start dragging this around to try and find a good sounding note, it's a lot more difficult to sound things that will stay in tune with your whole song. So if you just stick with pure octaves at first until you get a better understanding of what's going on, you're going to end up with a more pleasing sound overall. So now, like this one I just changed. Oh, it's higher. You can get some cool sounds like that, but a huge warning for you, massive flashing red lights here. You have to be really careful about that, because in essence, this is changing the pitch of your actual synthesizer that's playing. And so while you may be playing a C, if you shift it up like this, it'll be shifting to a different note of some sort, or maybe even between two notes, because you're no longer shifting it in actual scale. You're shifting by math, which can get very complicated. Over here you have the offset in hertz, so you're not quite shifting hertz, but it's pretty close. And I did this one time. I made a really cool sound that had some cool overtones and whatever, just playing by itself. Then once I added it back into my full song, it sounded awful. Everything was way out of tune. I was freaking out trying to figure out, did I change, the automation of the pitch or something? I was looking at all kinds of different things and couldn't figure it out. And then I came back here and realized I had just made some, whatever random ratios to my sound, and that didn't fit with my scale, my key, whatever I was playing at all. So for example, if we push this up to 4, then you so it really affects the sound quite a bit. Now I'm going to play a little thing that I just made some C notes here in a small pattern. This is what that sounds like. Now I'm going to play it again, and I'm going to start bringing this up slowly. And you'll hear it just go crazy out of tune. It'll sound terrible. But then I'll stop it, and you'll hear that the sound just by itself can sound pretty cool. But you have to remember, it's not just this one sound in isolation. You got to play it in key with everything else. So you can hear that sounds really bad. It's way out of tune, and if you don't hear that, then you just keep, stick with the octaves for now and learn what sounds good, and then eventually you'll start to hear that things don't sound in tune together, don't sound good together. That's very important if you're going to be producing music, especially with FM synthesis. But now if we play this note by itself, it sounds cool. It's got those overtones, it's got all those different harmonics playing at the same time. You wouldn't necessarily think that it would sound that bad with something else playing in the same key. But it does. So really be careful about this stuff. Now, another thing, you don't need to just stick with the octaves to make good sounds. If you're just starting out, again, I'd recommend that just to get the feel of overall FM. But once you kind of get the better feeling of that, you can, in FM8 at least, you can use math, again, something I'm not very good at, to figure out what ratios to use if you wanted to use, say, a fifth or a third or whatever. And basically, you would, I can post these ratios. I kind of made some equations, I guess you'd say, to figure out what frequency you want or what ratio you want to set. So basically, you're going to take the range, so subtract the top to the bottom one. So subtract 2 to 1, because that's a full octave, and you're left with 1, and then divide that by 12, and then that's how much you need to go up in the ratio for each step of a scale. Same thing if you wanted to do a higher octave, you would subtract 8 to 4, so then you have 4 divided by 12, and that's each step you would go up for your scale again. It can be very simple. So actually, if we pull up a calculator, let's go, so 8 minus 4, you're left with 4. So we divide by 12, because there are 12 steps in your scale, for most stuff. So you're going to go up by 0.333, whatever. Okay, so if we start with 4 here, start with 4. We're going to go up by 0.333 for each step. So there's up 1. There's 2. There's a third. So that's what you would want to do, basically. If you wanted a fifth, it'd be about that. And then between the high note and that low note that you can hear, if you pay attention, is the equivalent of a fifth plus some octaves. And again, if you just move this off by just a tiny bit, you can kind of fix it a little bit if it's a tiny bit off, because again, it's 0.333, not 0.334, what, you know, so math, again, rounding can influence your sound a little bit, so just be aware of that. And then also, if you adjust this by just a little bit, you can provide some nice dissonance to your sound, or phasing, or, you know, anything like that. So let's actually move this back down. Yeah, we'll go with 1 again. So we have that sound. As we bring this up a little bit, you're going to hear a little bit of phasing. And then the further we bring it, the more phasing you get, you know, the more modulation, wobble, whatever you want to call it. And it can be nice to add some width to your sounds, just add a little bit of movement, just add something else, you know. If it's a perfect octave all the time, that's fine, but if you wanted to add just a little bit of, you know, edge or grit to it, or, you know, just something a little bit different, you can move it up or down a little bit. Again, I wouldn't go up this much. I would stick to within like 20, you know, last 2 digits here. But again, it depends on your sound too. So if you're only using sine waves, it's not going to be as easy to tell. If you got some square waves going on, something with a lot more harmonics, you won't need as much because it'll be very obvious much quicker. So that's just something fun to play with. You can move that around no matter what, you know, thing you set to. If it's an octave, it's a step in your scale somewhere. Try moving it up or down just a little bit on 1 or however many you have. I wouldn't do it on all of them because that's very easy to get a messy kind of sound, but if you do it with 1 or 2, you may end up with something that sounds really good. So that's basically how FM8 handles their ratios, and you know, the different ways you can use it to your advantage. There's also this offset, which basically will offset this modulator here by a certain frequency, a certain amount of hertz. And I haven't used this too much, mostly because I haven't figured out a good way to use it to get a good sound. But if we reset this back to 1, we have this sound. And then as we bring this up, you can hear it's doing the same thing. It's slowly moving that sound out of pitch from what it was. So again, be very careful, because otherwise you can, you know, easily get this whole thing out of tune and it just make everything sound bad. But this could be an interesting thing to do. Now, the main difference between the offset and the ratio is the ratio will keep the same ratio no matter what note you push. So you push this note, it's going to be off by that same amount all the way up the scale, the keyboard, whatever. But it'll keep it in tune with those notes. This offset will keep this, you know, hertz ratio. So if you make it 118, it will move this E note, whatever note you push, up by 118 hertz. And that is different because each note, as you go up octaves, it's a much different scale. So you're effectively changing the ratio depending on which octave you're playing, or even higher or lower notes in the same octave. So This is interesting to try, but you have to be very careful. It's not nearly as beginner friendly as ratio. The ratio will keep everything in tune as long as you stick to the right numbers. The offset will not. It'll potentially change it depending on which octave you're playing. So it'll play a different ratio for like a C1 versus a C3. So that might sound good for you, but it also could be very difficult to get it to sound good. So use that with caution. So that was FM8. Now I want to go over operator a little bit. Another FM synthesis. It's the default one for Ableton Live. If you get like the suite version or some of the higher up ones packages, and it has these two knobs here, the coarse and the fine knobs. And so the coarse is how you bring it up. Like in FM8, you had from 1 to 2. You can have the whole numbers, and it's the same thing. It's not octaves 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever. It kind of is exponential. So you have 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16. And then the fine knob is everything from one octave to the next. So if you go from 1, this is essentially octave 2. Same note. Now if we go from 2, this is essentially the next octave up. So it's not 3. It's the 4. So that's a full octave from the 2 to the 4. So basically the same kind of control that you had with FM8. You just can't type in exact numbers. You have to kind of move the knobs around. And it's just a little different way of going about it. It is nice to have separate controls for the coarse and the fine, just because that way you don't have to worry about, if you want it to go up an octave, you only have to move one knob instead of trying to drag the right numbers and get it exactly. So it's kind of the same thing, but a little bit different in the way they go about it. And again, then they have this fixed button here. So if you toggle that, it changes this whole section here. So now you're adjusting this by a certain frequency. And then you have this multi here. So it's the same kind of thing. If you adjust it by a certain frequency, it's basically going to change your ratio depending on which octave you're playing, depending on which note you press, because it's not, again, notes don't have the same spacing from a C1 to a C8. The hertz change drastically. So this is not going to be the right answer all the time. But then you have this multi here, which if you look on this side box here is the help view. This is how you multiply that frequency. So you can kind of go up to 10. You can multiply it down by a lot lower numbers. So if we start at 1, it gets so low you can't even hear it. Or you can go really high up. So this kind of thing, if you modulate it with an LFO or a noise oscillator, could be really interesting to get just some crazy beeping sounds and just all over the place, just as a side note. But if you are going to use it, make sure, I would start again not using the fixed and just mostly using the coarse knob and try to stay on the octave. But again, you can move the fine if you can figure out where it's going to sound good and stay in key. Very important. So that's basically how operator works as far as FM synthesis. Now lastly, I just wanted to show you just an idea of a couple sounds you can make with the synthesis and choosing different ratios and not sticking to pure octaves. So if we do this one, and again, I haven't tried this with another synth, so this may be out of tune, but just play with it and try and figure out things that sound good, or like I said, use those equations to figure out how to find a fifth or whatever you want to find, a fourth, seventh. And try those out, to find which notes you like. And then, again, move it up and down a little bit until you find something that sounds cool. So that was one kind of sound. And then as we move up here, I'm bad at typing apparently. It's starting to sound a little bit more metallic as we move away from the bass note of 1, which you can also change this one. It's a different starting point. And so this is a really interesting sound. So it seems like the middle of my keyboard right now sounds the best. The higher notes are a little bit too high for me. The lower ones don't really have as much going on. But the middle notes gonna have some high and low, but it's not too much of anything. So that sounds pretty cool. So now if we were to play it with the other note, yeah, it's out of tune. So and then, so by dragging that up to almost 2.5, it comes pretty close into a note of some sort. I don't know which note that is right now. So if you pick a random thing and by itself, it sounds interesting. But then you start playing it with another note and realize this is horribly out of tune, this sounds really bad. Then you should try dragging it up or down slowly until it starts to come closer into some kind of sound that actually is decent, and then you can go back into it by itself and then mess with it some more and fine tune some things, add some other layers, whatever you want to do, and then go from there. But make sure if you're messing with the ratios, you always match it with another synth that's playing the same note or one in the same key at least, so that you can tell if this is gonna work and they're going to mesh together, or if it's just going to be terrible. Because this is a really good way to ruin your song if you don't pay attention to the ratio. So that's been the ratio section of FM. Maybe next time we'll go over some waveforms or a different part of FM synthesis. Let me know in the comments or send me a message, something. Let me know what you want to see about FM synthesis, or if that's a different type you'd like to see more about. Until then, thanks for watching. This is Jake from Cryonaut Media, and I'll see you next time.